Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk here. It's always intimidating to talk to an audience that's so technically capable. So when Mike asked me what I wanted to talk about, I thought it would be interesting to look at a non-technical topic that has implications, well, pretty much for everyone in the room. Certainly everyone who's interested in Python, which I presume you all are. So what I want to talk about is how do we promote the Python language and how do we improve the development process. So the first question, of course, if we're talking about building new communities, is what's wrong with the existing ones? Do they work? And the answer is, to a certain extent, they do, yes. So let me begin by saying I've invested huge amounts of time in the Python community, and I think it has a very well-deserved reputation for being one of the more welcoming open source communities. And today, I'm talking a little more broadly than just about Python. I thought it would be interesting if we could maybe say something that applies more broadly to all open source communities rather than just to Python. So this talk's being given at an unprecedented time in human history. I suppose every time is unprecedented in human history to some extent, but clearly, although it's a matter of interpretation, nowadays it's fairly hard to find someone in the modern world who doesn't agree that in some ways the world fails to meet the needs of many of its inhabitants. Historically, we're living in strange times. The world human population reached 7 billion, depending on who you believe, sometime between October 2011 and March 2012. And that growth from 6 billion to 7 billion took place in approximately 12 years. According to one UN estimate, it's possible that the world population will reach 10 billion before it actually reaches any kind of stability, and that the population in Africa could triple in this century. Now, however you interpret these figures, and obviously there is plenty of room for interpretation, but however you interpret the figures, it's obvious that most governments are going to be struggling with population growth in a world where they're already finding it difficult to manage things to everyone's satisfaction. So I have a lot of questions and not, I'm sorry, many answers, but being a geek, my approach attempts to be rational. We have to take into account what we know about human behavior, about the differences between the various political and cultural environments, the national cultures in which people live, and so on. And in an increasingly crowded world, it's very easy to feel threatened by governmental and economic systems that are posited on the prospect of continuous growth. If growth stops, then the economy goes down the tank. And I think that we're living through such a time at the moment. The effects of lack of growth in the economy are very apparent in all our daily lives. Now, when I was fairly young, in my early 20s, I guess, an organization called the Club of Rome produced a report, I don't know whether any of you remember it, called Limits to Growth. And the fundamental concept behind this Limits to Growth report was that the finite nature of many resources could, if growth weren't checked, lead to cataclysmic failures in supply of the very things that keep us alive: clean air, clean water, nutritious food. And this is actually where climate change deniers got their start. And yet, from recent work, it appears that the Club of Rome report was, in fact, within its limitations, a very accurate prediction of certain futures. So, I have to admit, my own version of the future kind of tends towards the catastrophic. I'm somewhat cynical about human nature, and I think it is, sadly, entirely possible that the human race might wipe itself out by fouling its own nest, ignoring the toxic environment that it's creating. So I see it as quite important for the future to try and bring this to people's attention and to do what I can which is not much, but to do what I can to ensure that we, that is the human race, not just Python enthusiasts, build a sustainable future for ourselves and for the other species that we have to share this huge ball of mud called planet Earth with. So I can already hear some people thinking, well, what's going on? This all seems a very long way from our little open source world. What's Steve doing? Is he trying to abuse his position as a keynote speaker to stand on a political soapbox and peddle socialistic ideas? Well, okay, I mean, people know I think that I am a socialist, and anywhere except America it's okay to admit that. In America, socialism still has kind of a bad name, which is actually an echo mostly from the bad reputation it was given by a character called Joe McCarthy in the 1950s. And those who know me know that I'm happy to stand on a soapbox at times, but this isn't actually one of those times. But context is everything, so I wanted to give some context to my remarks today by placing them, I want to place them in the context of a world that isn't working, that doesn't divide resources up equitably, and which is seeing ever larger divisions open up between the poor and the rich, both within individual countries, and of course the differences between poor countries and rich countries are also accelerating rather than diminishing. And at the same time, huge amounts of resource are, at least in my opinion, I don't know who agrees with me, being wasted on machinery to wipe each other out, which I suppose would be one answer to the population problem. This is particularly noticeable in my current home country, the United States. The United States is a country where 11% of the world population spends over 40% of the world's military expenditures. And that 40% represents more than the next 14 top spending countries put together. So group China, France, Germany, Israel, the United Kingdom. Take all of those and several other countries' military expenditures, put them up against the total of America, and America's spending more than those. Now, you might wonder what America's afraid of, but these expenditures certainly do give them some clout in the geopolitical sphere. And I sometimes think that since the Second World War, American foreign policy has actually been based on the idea that you will do what we say, otherwise we will demonstrably come and bomb the hell out of you. And they have actually bombed the hell out of several people as several peoples every decade. But open source communities, and the Python community included, have growth problems of their own. There was a report in 2008 by Amit Deshpande and Dirk Reilly, and they said that the number of lines of open source code is now growing exponentially. And I'm sure we've all seen that. The amount of open source code that becomes available is huge. Now, some of it, of course, is of dubious value, but some of it, like Python, Ruby, the languages, the infrastructures like Apache, there are a lot of good things which are extremely useful, extremely valuable, but this growth in the amount of source code is a problem that isn't really being addressed at the moment. So Deshpande and Real suggest that open source applications in 2006 generated revenues of $1.8 billion. And of course, it's been growing pretty much unimpeded ever since. Now, $1.8 billion isn't actually a huge amount. When you look at the total that's spent worldwide on software every year, it's only about 0.75% of total software revenues, or at least that was the case in 2006. So clearly, if we're seeking world domination for open source, we still have a long way to go. We're going to be occupied for quite a while yet. We can't retire to our islands in the sun. Tim O'Reilly made a very sensible case at OSCON this year that open source is actually responsible for huge economic benefits. The example that he used was of a single internet service provider whose software, as most internet service providers nowadays are, of course, whose software was almost entirely based on an open source stack. And he suggested that that single hosting company had small to medium enterprises as the majority of its customers. He presented evidence that providing a small to medium enterprise with a website is likely to increase its turnover by approximately 10% on the average. And just looking at the small to medium enterprises that were customers of that one internet service provider, then there was an increase in their total revenues due to the use of open source products of approximately $180 billion. That's a significant impact on the economy. Now, even proprietary software products nowadays contain significant open source components. So it's impossible to measure the true value of open source. But certainly it's getting visibly more significant with each passing day. So I've said a number of times on record that the open source community, or the emergence of the open source world, represents a new economic phenomenon. And the way I think of it is, it's as though when the railways had to be built across the United States, a bunch of people with a certain amount of engineering experience picked up their picks and shovels and said, you know, that's a great idea. Let's just go and build a railway system. Now, you can't, of course, build a railway system without access to heavy engineering, which is arguably difficult, although perhaps not impossible, to open source. And similarly, most individuals wouldn't really find it cost-effective to build their own computers from scratch or to interconnect them in the way that the infrastructure of the internet does. Just the same, the emergence of Linux as a powerful force in the software world and the somewhat anarchic, less than formal management of the whole internet, despite US politicians' belief that the internet should be managed by the United States as some kind of divine right, these occurrences should convince us that it is actually possible for individual and group initiatives to take hold and to prosper and to benefit even today's rather strained commercial environments. Now, I understand that open source isn't the exclusive domain of unpaid experts, but I think it's a significant fact that a lot of the people who contribute to open source phenomena, despite the fact that corporations are paying people now to write open source, but a lot of people who contribute to open source still do so not through primarily economic motives at all. They contribute to open source because they think it's the right thing to do. And when you see there's going to be a version of this talk up on my blog after I've given it, and when you see that talk, you'll see that I link to this speech I referred to formerly by Tim O'Reilly, and he made some very interesting comparisons in there, and he said that basically his work, the work of O'Reilly Media, is based on adding more value than you extract. And I think that's a very useful thing to think about, and he put up details. He put up pictures of several prominent Wall Street personalities, and he said those people just don't get it. They don't realize that the only way to maintain a sustainable economy is to add more value than you extract. And he was bemoaning the fact that the capitalist world generally seems to be heading in the direction of becoming more and more rapacious, of being less and less careful about the use of limited resources, of being absolutely unconcerned with delivering value to the customer base. And we've seen that with companies like, well, never mind which companies, but we've seen it with large financial organizations who seem to be principally determined to extract every last dollar they can from every situation, no matter what the consequence to the economy at large, or even to their own customer base, who notionally they exist to serve. And of course, the idea that we can just, that there is value in creating common infrastructure whose presence benefits a large proportion of the world's population or some communities inside it, rather than a single individual or an organization, seems, particularly in the United States, somewhat socialistic and therefore somewhat suspect. But the fact remains that nowadays, huge companies like IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Microsoft, Google, they're enthusiastically involved in myriad open source projects, and they apparently see benefit in that. So, let's just look briefly at the way that software is built. Here's a fairly typical example of the way that the software development lifecycle is represented, and it represents a large number of different activities, different requirements, which deserve to be looked at in detail. Now, whether all these activities are strictly necessary or not, that could be a subject of a pleasant discussion over drinks. But I get the definite impression that a lot of open source projects aren't really engaged in any kind of formal process. Now, the freedom to develop in the absence of a formal process is, to an extent, one of the things that attracts people into the open source world. And I'd certainly be the last person to suggest that unnecessary work should be involved in software production. But it is true, I think, that some of the things that companies do are things that we ought to think about doing ourselves. So when we look at who builds software, well, this is, again, a typical way the production of computer software is envisaged. And you'll see that there's a large number of different roles, a large number of teams. But when you look at the average open source project, well, you start to wonder, okay, who's managing this project? Is anybody managing it? Is there any kind of management process? And, sometimes management is by decree. Most open source projects seem to be happier by using some sort of consensus approach. And I think that the consensus approach does build reasonable software, but sometimes there is a need for somebody to manage the process, at least in the sense that someone has to make decisions, difficult decisions sometimes. So, I mean, who is the owner of Python, for example? Who's the architecture team? Do we have an architecture team? Is there any formal architecture for the Python language and for the Python project? So, arguably, none of the ways that we think about the development process is specifically right or wrong, but when you think about commercial projects that are equivalent in size to the Python interpreter, for example, there will usually be many more people involved than just programmers. So Python, like most open source projects, or certainly like a lot of other open source projects, the Python world nowadays is mostly occupied by developers, people whose primary skills are programming. Hands up if you regard yourself as a programmer. Okay, thank you very much. That's about, 80% of the room. Hands up if you don't regard yourself as a programmer. Look around carefully. These are the people that we need to be very nice to. These are the people we need to invite back. These are the people we need to encourage, even if they're managers. So, Python, like most other open source projects, has to press developers into service to fill the other roles, or alternatively, it has to leave the roles unfilled, and things which may, or arguably may not, but I mean, however you want to look at it, there are some of those roles which in the Python project and in other open source projects aren't really being filled at the moment, to the detriment, I would argue, of the project. So here are some of the typical roles that a largest software development requires. And I would argue lots of times in the open source world, projects either focus solely on the programming task with a little design work mixed in, and many of the other roles aren't particularly attractive for developers. And so the developers simply ignore the need to fill them because either they don't have the skill set or they don't actually want to do the work, which is reasonable enough. You can't press people into service. You have to ask them to volunteer. And sometimes this operates to the project's detriment. So I was thinking, well, what would be a good example that people could relate to in the Python world? And the thing that came to my mind is the Python documentation. Now, Python is known for the strength and the usefulness of its documentation, but good as it is, and I mean, I do seriously laud the writers of the Python documentation, but good as it is, particularly in comparison with a number of other open source projects, it still sucks. If you're new to Python, it sucks rocks. And the reason it does so is because it's organized by and for people who basically already understand the Python language. And to give you a concrete example, I still have no idea why, when I want documentation on the basic Python standard types, int, float, list, dict, set, where do I go for that documentation? Where are they documented? The Python standard library, absolutely right. Why the hell, since I don't have to use an import statement to access these things, why are they documented in the library handbook? It just doesn't make any sense at all. Now that raises a significant barrier to entry for people who are trying to learn Python on their own. Simply not knowing where to find the necessary information is sufficient for someone to look at Python and say, oh, well, I can't find the information I need, I'm going to choose some other language. And I mean, I don't regard that as an absolute tragedy. I don't regard Python as the language that everyone must learn. And I mean, people who know me know that although I'm enthusiastic about Python, I'm also an advocate of a very rich software ecosphere where not only Python but other languages coexist peacefully and happily, and you can use the language that's best for your particular task. So I'm not suggesting that we need to change Python and the Python documentation simply for the sake of it, or so that Python can beat other languages in some way. Now, anyone that's used Python seriously for a year or more knows these oddities about the Python documentation, and they can usually find out where to look for the information that they need. But this is the wrong emphasis. Who's the advocate for a rewrite or a reorganization of the documentation? Who is agitating for the documentation to become better? People are making small incremental changes all the time, and I'm very glad that they are. It's difficult and thankless work, and we should praise the people who do that work. But at the same time, nobody in the current development team relishes the task of reorganizing and restructuring the documentation because we don't have technical authors and technical editors as a part of our community. And yet this issue causes learners way more pain than it should, and it even turns people away from the language. So it's something that we do need to think about. And this is my central thesis, really, that if we don't broaden our community to include such people, to include people with necessary ancillary skills to programming, if we just remain a closed community of programmers, then we're unlikely to achieve the world domination that we kind of jokingly all feel that Python could. Now, I know from my own work with Python over the last 18 years, and from visiting Python gatherings like this one all over the world, I've been to conferences as far away as Singapore and South America. I visited PyCon UK, I've been to EuroPython. I've tried in my way as far as I can to communicate and to listen to Python users all over the world. And it's my estimation that Python is poised at the moment for massive growth. If you think it's done well in its first 20 years, you've got a whole different world coming nowadays. It would be very easy if we made a concerted effort to make Python the language of choice for literate students, For pre-literate students, arguably languages like Scratch might be more appropriate, and kids can learn from those languages. But the world is now waking up in a big way to the fact that computational thinking is an important skill in today's complex world. People need to be able to look at problems, they need to be able to analyze them, they need to be able to synthesize solutions. And programming is basically, that's what programming involves. So the Python world, whoops, wait a minute, sorry, lost my place. Haven't used this tablet before. Yeah, so the Python world is struggling to achieve the relevance that it could. And yet, Python is becoming more and more popular. And I think Python is almost, as far as programming languages go, I think Python is the ideal expression of computational thinking. So, do we want to slam the doors in people's faces? Do we want to say, no, we like things the way they are, thank you, we aren't going to change, we're just going to keep on going the way we are, and if you don't like it, fine, then go and use some other language. And that's understandable in some ways, I suppose. I can understand why people might want to do that, but nevertheless, it's not a productive way to behave. As a PSF director, I have to be mindful of our duty to promote the development of the language and to grow the international community. So I have to force myself to look for deficiencies which hopefully we can then rectify. And this means not looking inwards, but looking outwards. We've got to look outwards. We've got to look for people who bring new skills to our community. So we've got to try to work with people who we might not actually regard as natural partners. People with skills that don't, people who don't just have programming skills. Maybe people who have no programming skills whatsoever, and yet they've got, other skills that we might need. So the alternative to reaching out to people, to being more inclusive, is either to ignore the need for roles to be filled, or to have someone fill them whose time would be better spent writing code. And neither of those are particularly satisfactory solutions. Sarah Novotny, who is one of the co-chairs of the O'Reilly OSCON conference, wrote of her experience, not at this year's, but of the 2011 conference. She said, "We must challenge the idea that if someone really wants to use a piece of software, he or she must be willing to slog through half-written documentation, read the actual code base, and cope with an unkind user interface." Now, this is an approach that I've tried to promote to Python developers with, I have to say, rather limited success. And I can think of several reasons why that might be so, but basically, if you've got a lot of investment in something, you tend to defend the status quo. And there are some classic signs that the status quo is being defended. So first one is considering the costs of switching, making a change, considering the costs of switching before you consider the potential benefits. Oh, well, it would be really difficult to do that because... Okay, maybe it would be difficult. But let's focus on whether it's a desirable goal or not. If it's a desirable goal, then it's worth undertaking a difficult challenge. Another sign that the status quo is being defended is highlighting the pain that a change would cause to a few people, rather than the benefits that it would offer to many. Another one is focusing on short-term costs instead of long-term benefits. The short-term cost is, well, it's going to, somebody's going to have to write that code. The benefits are that Python will be easier to use. And another sign that the status quo is being defended is embracing sunk costs. It took me 3 months to write that code, and you want me to throw it away? Well, the point is, of course, that if the code's not doing anything useful, it's far better thrown away than it is maintained in the code base. So I would argue that we need to broaden the development community to include people with necessary skills for the development of our software, even though we aren't necessarily comfortable getting close to those people. This makes sense to me from a historical perspective as well. Back in the old days, I'm talking about 20 years ago now, not 50 years ago, but back in the old days, using an open source project was very likely to involve getting involved as a contributor as well and contributing to the code base. Nowadays, I think there are many other roles that could be filled by contributors. Bug reporting, technical writing, blogging, testing, so on and so forth. And I'm sure you've all got your own ideas as well for roles that we could introduce to the project that would decrease your own workload if you happen to be a Python core developer as well. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of David Eves, who's worked for the Mozilla Corporation and done a lot of work on how software communities can use metrics to improve the development process and to monitor community involvement. And he's given talks where he's demonstrated the collection of relatively simple statistics that are, the data can be extracted from the development process. We've now, all software teams nowadays tend to use version control systems. And so you can start to ask yourselves, like, why are, once you collect information about how long it takes for bugs to be reviewed, then you can ask yourself, well, okay, why does a bug in this section of the code take on average 3 times as long to get a review as a bug in another section of the code? Another interesting question is, who's been a consistent contributor for the last 18 months, but yet hasn't made any contribution in the last 30 days? And if you focus on statistics like that, then you can start to ask yourself relevant questions. Has this person become pissed off? Have they become disgruntled with the development process? Has someone upset them? Have they been refused some change that they wanted to make? Why has someone who is a productive contributor to our project suddenly become a non-contributor? What's happened to change their minds about contributing to our project? Now, as far as I'm aware, the Python world isn't actually looking at those metrics at the moment. It's not even collecting them, let alone working with them. But the thing is, if we're prepared to answer questions like that, then we can actually use the information to improve some of it will be qualitative information, some of it will be quantitative information, but we can use that information to continue to grow and improve our community. And of course, once you have a community, you have to accept that not everybody in the community wants to be involved outside a fairly narrow specialism. That's entirely natural. That's how corporations are organized. That's how work is organized, generally speaking. People have a specialism, and that's fine with me. I've got no problem with that. I'd much rather have a contented community member contributing their skills than seeing them pressed into some role outside their comfort zone, which they won't necessarily do a particularly good job at, and which therefore won't necessarily improve Python's reputation or ability. But at the same time, there's a growing amount of evidence that an inability to contribute because of some fault in process or because of some perhaps because of the behavior of communities, but the inability to contribute for whatever reason is a source of frustration to people who would like to become active members of our community. So if we want to grow the community, we've got to be welcoming and, dare I say it, open to new members. Now, you're probably aware that the Python Software Foundation has commissioned a complete rewrite of the python.org website. This is going to be a major project. It's only recently started. And basically, this is an attempt by the foundation to democratize the content of the website, to lower the barriers to making a contribution. The idea is that people can directly affect the content of the website as it relates to their areas of competence without requiring the mediation of a webmaster team who are familiar with the gory internal technical details of the site and the process that you have to go through to produce the content. And I have to say, we last rewrote or recreated the site in, I think it was 2004, 2005, certainly 7 or 8 years ago now. And the way that content is produced looks very outdated now. I wouldn't like to have to, well, I mean, we actually tried the experiment of going to someone who wasn't a Python user and finding out how difficult it would be for them to make a contribution to the website. So first of all, you have to install Python, then you have to install this, then you have to install that. There is no easy way to become a contributor to the website at the moment without having an intimate knowledge of Python. So we also need, I think, to reach out to the people with the skills to enhance our community, to make our software better, more user-friendly, more robust, better documented, and so on. All the things that I'm sure we all really want Python to be. And I don't wish it to be thought that I'm in any way decrying the existing community. The existing community does a fantastic job, but think how much better things could be if their skills were augmented by people who are currently totally outside the demographic of the developer community. One of the advantages of open source to many participants, of course, is its lack of corporate rules and regulations. And nevertheless, I think we have to accept that whether or not we're in the corporate world, we do face many of the same problems that businesses who generate software do, and I'm sure that many of you are involved in businesses that generate software. So if we can find new and creative solutions to these problems, that's great. If we can't find new and creative solutions, however, then we shouldn't necessarily ignore the solutions that have already been developed in the corporate world. So, besides wanting to increase the size of the existing Python community, there's that world domination theme coming again, I'd also like to see the Python world reaching out more. Reaching out determinedly to groups supporting specific application areas like accounting, law, the conference industry, the print industry, the transport industry, the aerospace industry, and so on. And when you look at the special interest groups at the moment, I think you'll find that all of the special interest groups are pretty narrowly focused on tiny little vertical areas of the Python system itself. But if you think about the scientific community is a stellar example of the sort of collaborations that I'm thinking about. Now, in science, the science community, or should I say the subset of the science community that uses Python, they're not interested in Python for the abstract beauty of the language or because they think it's a nice programming language, and they don't have any ambition or desire to contribute to the core. They use Python because it's demonstrably an effective tool for solving their problems. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that the reason people choose any kind of software tool, unless they're intimately involved with its development, is the motivation of almost all users outside the development community is the wish to solve problems which have nothing to do with Python itself. So I have a secret life as a conference organizer, as the head of the Open Bastion, and at the moment, as another example, I'm using Python in the shape of Eldarian's Symposion project, which is the piece of software that's used to manage PyCon. I have now also used it to manage DjangoCon, ApacheCon Europe, which is next week, by the way. It's also managing the CloudStack Collaboration Conference, and it's going to be managing ApacheCon North America next year. And while it does currently have many failings, I mean, I wouldn't say that it is by any means at the moment a finished product, but my approach is to use it intensively and to feed back those problems to the developers for fixes. Now, as the company grows and as funds become available, we intend to invest in improvements that will make our jobs as conference organizers easier and more effective. And that investment will come in two forms, either direct payments to Eldarian for development work, or possibly payments to outside programming groups who will then make push requests to Eldarian to have the new functionality incorporated. So I'm hoping that eventually, once Eldarian and I have together built the project into a tool that non-specialist users can be happy with, then Eldarian and the Open Bastion will actually find a market among other companies like the Open Bastion, small to medium-sized companies running small to medium-sized conferences, and another industry will fall under Python's sway. So repeating successes like that across many industries is, in my opinion, the best way to make Python more popular. The many existing successes that Python can demonstrate already are a stable platform on which to base this effort. We've got a lot of success that we can talk about in the Python world. Now, doing this is going to involve effort because, again, we've got to explain open source to people who aren't as familiar with the melia as we are and whose interest is limited to the areas in which Python can help them to do their jobs. But I think it's something that we really need to think about. So, Python has the ability, as a mature technology, to solve a lot of problems for people. And I think it's probably time now to start looking at Python not exactly as a finished work. There'll always be things to do to improve Python, but at least to think of it as something that we can present as a feature-complete tool for many different areas of application. There's recently been an admission by the United Kingdom government that its computer education has gone through a period in the dark ages. For the past 10 years, the majority of the computer education in UK schools has consisted of teaching people to use Microsoft Office, which is really not anything to do with computing at all. It's computer literacy rather than computational thinking or computational science. But now they've acknowledged that the Microsoft route is not something that's necessarily good to be emulated. And it looks as though computational thinking has, at least in the UK, been accepted as a core skill in today's world. And I think that most other national governments will come to the same conclusion. So it looks as though Python will be adopted in the UK aggressively as a teaching language, thanks, among other things, to the release of the Raspberry Pi hardware, for which Python is the preferred programming language. And I hope that success can be mirrored in many other countries. So if we're prepared to engage other groups with different skill sets from our own, if we can listen to their needs, we can build new communities who will complement our existing skill set and will help us promote Python worldwide in a multitude of different application areas. And the benefit of doing that work to the Python community are only a tiny portion of the gains that will be made. I mentioned at the start of my talk that the world is demonstrably broken and that central governments have increasingly neither the resources, nor the imagination, nor the flair to apply global solutions to local problems. And it seems self-evident, to me at least, that it's much more sensible to try and solve local problems locally, in much the same way that the Swiss canton system of government does. And so we need to try to work to persuade governments to release some of their central control and some of their funding to communities that have the power to solve those problems. We ran DjangoCon in September, and a gentleman called Eric Sterling gave a very engaging keynote. And in that keynote, he suggested that it's important for a much broader population, cross-section of the population, to make their needs known to government. He made a compelling case for becoming involved in the political process, if you like. And I don't mean standing as a candidate, I mean entering into a dialogue with government to try to get some understanding within government of how some of the serious technical problems that we face, the serious global economic problems that we face, might be solved with the help of open source. So the nice thing about the open source world is that basically open source developers are a group who only have to see an itch to start thinking about the best way to scratch it. And I think that open source devotees are in a position to provide some valuable answers to the questions involved in fixing today's complex problems. But in order to fix those complex problems, we've got to step outside our comfort zone a little. We've got to reach out. We've got to engage with government. We've got to engage with commerce at all levels. And so I hope to persuade open source enthusiasts to use their skills to do so. The world's broken, and I think with determination and goodwill, we can help to fix it. This is a very exciting time to be a Python programmer. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Questions?
It was apparently all blindingly obvious.
What is the question? If you don't feel comfortable with English, you can ask in German and we can translate.
Oh, that's fine.
You made it very obvious, obviously. So, thank you very much again for your keynote. No, there's one. Okay.
Do you think that government initiated initiative to make programming more common among young people, for example? Does that make sense, or should it come from the community, be community driven rather than government driven?
That's a good question. I think it requires input from both sides. I think that the ability for central government to control policy and to dictate that certain subjects should or should not be taught in schools, for example, I think we need government to impose sensible policies. I think it's important that well, okay, thinking about computing, I think of the computing world as a sort of a pyramid, right? So at the bottom, you've got what's normally referred to as computer literacy. So people need to be able to know how to use a spreadsheet, how to use a word processor, what a database is, input and output, that kind of stuff. They need to be familiar with it, but they're sort of like the car drivers, if you like. Most people who drive cars have no idea how the thing works. They just want to get in the car and drive it around. So those people are currently receiving adequate education in many countries. But then there are two levels above. There's the middle level of computational thinking, where we might say those are where the typical Python user works. And then right at the top of the pyramid, there's computer science, where you're not just applying the technology, you're inventing new technologies. So I think that the role of the community, and particularly the existing open source community, is to try to explain to government what the desirable policy goals should be. I don't think I know a single Western government where there's a sensible appreciation of computer science or of computational thinking. I don't know of a single Western country where computer science or computational thinking education is being adequately managed at the moment. So it's important to involve government because government has the ability to dictate policy. It has access to funding, which is the principal way by which policy can be affected. But I think it's important for a dialogue to take place between the government and the community to make sure that the goals that government is aiming for are appropriate for the benefit of the whole community.
And then I have a follow-up question. How do you think can we as a community install these the need at the government to get to sensible policies? Because I don't know if you follow the German discussions about censorship on the web and stuff like that, where against all experts, the politicians, march along their ideology.
Well, right. Well, that's why I say it's important. It's important to give governments the information, but I think we need to be a little more assertive than just providing with information. So we have to be. I think those of us who perceive the weaknesses in governmental computer education policy should actually be much more determined and much more audible and much more visible about explaining why things are that way. And it's very easy to say, oh, well, I'm just a programmer, I can't change these things. But we are all citizens of our countries. We all have a vote. We all have the right to talk to our representatives. How many people in the room even know the name of their national government representative? Okay, maybe 3% of the room. That's pretty feeble, isn't it? How many people have ever contacted their representative because they are unsatisfied with something and they want to try and agitate for change? Okay, so this is despite not knowing their names. Well done. Of course, it is becoming easier now to get access to government, to make policy input. With the internet, for example, when you probably remember the SOPA debate where the American government tried to bring in some very rebarbative legislation about privacy, and there was a huge outcry, which within a month had effectively had the policy withdrawn. So I think that the tools for approaching government and for making ourselves heard have actually, as a result of the introduction of internet technologies, they've helped a lot. But I think what's really required, going back to the previous slide, what's really required is that we have to take responsibility. And I notice particularly in the United States, there's a brand of thinking which effectively says that the government should be totally responsible for our welfare from cradle to grave. And I don't think that's at all appropriate. I think we need to take responsibility for our own welfare. And I think if we need to be much more determined when government goes astray, we basically need a way to kick it up the ass and say, look, you're going the wrong way, turn back. So that's something that's getting easier and easier all the time. Okay? Armin. I think you just switched it off. I'll repeat the question if you can't make the microphone work.
I think the most Hello? Okay. I think the term government is a very ancient term. It's a little bit top-down, to be ruled or to follow rules and not to make your own rules, to create the stuff and influence or make new rules or use communication to change the world. So today we have all the tools. We are developing tools like that.
Well, today we have better tools. I wouldn't say we have all the tools.
And it's important to know how to use these tools, to take influence, and you can change a lot of stuff, like you said with the SOPA stuff.
Yep.
And if the people are raising and take action, they can change a lot of things.
Yes, I think the problem at the moment, or it's easy to state the problem. It's not so easy to quite so easy to understand what to do about it. But I think the issue is that at the moment, government does not see itself as existing to serve the people. They seem to believe that their role is to tell the people what to do or to impose control, rather than to enable the will of the people. And I think that what we have to be determined about is changing that direction. If we get a government that doesn't do what we think it should do, collectively, of course, it's always difficult, particularly in democratic governments with two-party systems where you tend to be bimodal. It's difficult to do that. I sometimes say that the way that America's been running its national policies for the past 20 or 30 years is like trying to steer an oil tanker when the only control you have is to turn the rudder hard to the right or hard to the left. What we need is a way of keeping the rudder kind of sensibly in the middle and just making small corrections when necessary.
One more important change we have, everybody sees how successful the Raspberry Pi was created. There was an idea, they had the design, they had the follow-up, the concept, and they did the funding for it.
Yep.
So a lot of people thinking about making a startup were struggling how to make an elevator pitch for venture capital companies, stuff like that. But there's now very easy to get the information for bootstrapping your business from zero, using platforms like Kickstarter or stuff like that. If you have an idea, you put it there, do a nice presentation, collect all the money you need for tools, something like that, set up the distribution and simply do it. So that is very, very different to the possibilities you had 20 years ago.
Well, indeed, but at the same time, Kickstarter's fairly limited. I'm not aware of anyone. You couldn't, for example, suppose you wanted to develop a commercial supersonic airliner. You're not going to fund something like that through Kickstarter, are you? So some projects have to be the province of government, simply because
I should not offend our main sponsor for the next PyCon.de, but maybe it's possible.
No, I don't think they'll be too offended. Besides which, it's only me. Gentleman in the corner there, I think.
You made some statements about education. I think it's a very big problem to get teachers convinced to use Python in school. I made this experience because I have 3 children which are now at universities, but teachers nowadays, maybe some are here and are upset now, but most teachers don't know anything about Python. And I think that's a very big problem. And the best way to get them convinced is maybe at the next Python conference that young people show their teachers how modern programming is really working. That's the only way you can solve this problem.
Yeah, well, okay, there's another issue, of course, which is that teachers aren't actually paid to get the training that they need to be able to learn Python and to teach it. So one of the things that I'm currently working on is ways in the United Kingdom to give teachers access to Python education so that they can be comfortable in the schoolroom. But another thing that I say to teachers is you don't have to worry that the kids will teach you, basically. The kids will teach you. But the problem is that requires that the teachers' attitudes have to be turned on their head. They have to be comfortable teaching a subject where demonstrably they know less about it than the students do. Now, the value of having a teacher in the room is not necessarily as a superior source of knowledge, it's as a way to direct the students' learning. Very interesting piece from the OLPC project. Negroponte said that they dropped a set of Motorola Zoom tablets on a remote African village, and they didn't even unpack them. They just left them sitting there in the boxes as an experiment. Now, this is a village where none of the children were literate. They'd never seen an alphabet. There were no street signs in the village. And within 5 months, they'd actually rooted the Zoom's Android operating system to change it in ways that they wanted to. So there's a huge potential for computer education. In some ways, the biggest problem is persuading the teachers to get out of the way and let the kids learn, instead of feeling that they have to be pushing them in the direction of the knowledge that they themselves have.
What you said is aiming also at didactics. We had today a workshop with the guy before in front of me, and the thing is, in Germany, the formal education of teachers is more focused on their scientific discipline, and they have very poor didactic skills. It's sad to say that, but it's awful.
Well, indeed. I mean, there are many different problems with education.
If you're a professional teacher, and maybe the English teacher misses his lesson, and you're a mathematics teacher, and you have your degree, Abitur in Germany, and you must be able to take over the other lesson, because of your knowledge. You have this certificate that you know what you have learned. In fact, he doesn't remember it, but there's a very big gap between what is told about the value of education and in fact remains in the brain if you leave school.
Well, that's true, but more and more education is becoming available and becoming open. Harvard University, for example, has opened up many of its courseware now, many of its courses, so that you can't get the degree, but you've got access to the materials. And I think more and more the future of education is in self-learning. The academic world has finally become aware of the way that the publishing world has effectively been controlling the flow of information. And so now a lot of academic organizations are starting to self-publish, and they're just saying, well, we'll eschew the formal journals and we'll just put the information on the internet where it's available to anyone. That seems to me the best way to proceed. In other words, the world is moving so fast now that you can't design an education system for 30 years ahead. You have to devise some kind of agile education system where people have access to the information that they need to solve the problems that face them now, not the problems that face the people who designed the syllabus 30 years ago.
Thank you very much.
I think we're done. Thank you.
Right at time. Thank you very much for your keynote. Very interesting topic.